Hello everyone, my name is CJ and today I have a teacher of FUNDAY with me whose name is Steven. Would you like to introduce yourself a bit?
I would. My name is Steve. I'm sure many of you have known me or you have known me for maybe a while at FUNDAY or maybe not. But, I consider myself a very kind of just a chill person, I guess. Just to give everyone a little bit of a background information. I was born in Taipei, right? Not a lot of people know this. Most people think I'm born in the States, but actually born in Taipei, but I went to the U.S. As a baby, like 6 months. I went there, and then I pretty much lived there for most of my life, there and Canada in Toronto.
Oh, okay. So because of this background, later we are going to have an episode discussing the variation of English accents later. In North America. But now I do want to give you some more spotlights, because Steve had actually worked at FUNDAY for quite a while, even longer than me. And if you're students at FUNDAY, probably you have taken one or two of his classes. And as Stephen has just mentioned, you are someone who prefer to be more chilled out and more laid back. And is that also the same attitude that you will bring into a classroom all the time?
I wouldn't say all the time, but I would say yes, most of the time. Most of the time, I always try to bring this attitude to students. I think it's specifically because I want the students to feel comfortable speaking English. I understand that learning this language, English, it causes a lot of anxiety. For a lot of students, they're kind of afraid to speak out certain times, and I think bringing a chill environment, it makes it's easier to talk, right? And I think for them, a lot of students have mentioned that they felt that it's comfortable, speaking English. It almost feels like you're talking to a friend, right? It's not just a classroom. It has that different feeling to it.
If we could imagine that we are actually just talking to friends, perhaps it could make us feel a bit more comfortable in class. But I do wonder, from your perspective, usually when we enter a classroom trying to learn something from the teacher in a teacher-student setting, where does that anxiety come from, usually, in your opinion?
My opinion, I think for a lot of students, anxiety comes from, the desire to make no mistakes, to be perfect. Because I do notice that a lot of students, they may not really, speak up personally. Is only really because they're afraid to make the mistakes, like pronunciation or maybe grammar or something like that. But I feel like once you start to get to know the students more than just a student, like maybe as a friend or a close friend, they start to speak more fluently or naturally in some cases. Right?
I do feel like maybe it's just me, at least at my age, when I was still a student, making mistakes is something that is not allowed,
Yes.
So when you are in class or when you're taking classes, you don't really get that much positive feedback, but you do get a lot of negative feedback.
Right, yes. Yes, indeed.
If you lose 1 point, you are going to face some punishments.
Right.
I feel like perhaps this is the way that a lot of Taiwanese students have received education and perceived education. So whenever they go into a new learning setting, maybe that's where the anxiety comes from. But that is just my theory. I wonder whenever you are in class and you feel that maybe this student is particularly anxious, what would you do to help him or her?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a lot of cases like this when a student felt that they just were very nervous. They couldn't really say much. I still remember a particular time when I actually, asked the student, their hobbies, pretty much all the normal stuff that you might ask someone, right, like a friend. And it's only then that they start telling me about certain things that I felt they wouldn't have told me if I didn't ask them such a question, right? And I feel like after they got more comfortable, I try to dive deeper into maybe perhaps their work or maybe their hobbies. I try to get on the same level as them, and I think that's a really great way to get them to open up. I might even have the other teachers ask, like I might ask other students to help them and to ask them some questions pertaining to what they just said. It's all really to make the student feel comfortable and not feel hostile, right?
I think it is actually the teacher's responsibility, even though this is kind of challenging to do, to empower and to encourage the students to speak out, because I feel like the anxiety in the classroom for students, sometimes not just about whether he or she is going to make a mistake and be corrected, like maybe he or she will feel ashamed by that. Right. The other thing is that a lot of students of mine, at least, I feel like they have pretty low self-esteem, not just about their language level, but maybe about their life as well.
I think so.
They will feel like, well, as an individual, I don't really have that much to show off.
Sure.
I think that is the interesting part of, or maybe you can call it like a characteristic of Asian culture. Because, for example, when we were chatting at FUNDAY, we have a lot of teachers from other countries. And you can feel like they love to share their personal life. a lot of their personal information, but not Taiwanese students.
Yeah, that's probably the culture. It's the biggest difference.
And I feel like they might feel like they are under pressure of being compared, or maybe people will be they might be judged if they share too much.
Right.
I don't know. Right. So as you mentioned, that is a kind of a cultural difference. But if you are chatting with someone who is maybe a native user of English, how do you think that they can bridge the gap, or perhaps to cross that and become more
open-minded or
expressive? Yeah, maybe.
Yeah. I mean, it's really hard to say, because normally especially for conversation parts, I always tell the students that, in order to improve in something like this, you just have to keep speaking. Like, I know it sounds cliche, but to be honest, I feel like if you want to practice something, then it just practice makes perfect. You have to keep doing it over and over to the point where you even feel that it just comes out naturally. You don't have to put effort into doing it. It's just something that is, right? It's just there. But I did mention a point to students. I did mention to them that, if they wanted to kind of like bridge a gap, so to speak, or to kind of feel more like talking like a foreigner or speaking in that tone or manner, I always tell them, like, try to immerse themselves in an English environment, because I know for Taiwanese students, they think more in the Taiwanese way, but that's the culture. That's fine. But in English, of course, the way you talk, the way you think is completely different, right? So I asked them to listen to English music, watch English movies. All these things I think can give them. I wouldn't say, like, maybe it wouldn't help too much for some, but I think it gives it would give an edge for them to understand, like, the connotations, or
that is true.
The expressive way that one can express themselves in this environment.
I feel like the process for learning is a very long journey that you have to get used to. Like you said, the connotation and how people speak, their ways of speaking. Another thing is that you have to get used to making mistakes. That is what I believe. And perhaps what you suggest is critical, because only when you start speaking a lot, to the point that you are not afraid and you get used to, you're familiar with making mistakes and being corrected, probably that is the only way for you to improve. I think
is the fastest way. It's probably the fastest way, if you ask me.
But I also understand that some students would be so hesitant to make that first step.
That's correct.
So I want to ask ourselves, like, when we were still students, we also feel the anxiety of making mistakes as well. Right. Yes. So how do you overcome that? How did you overcome that? Or do you have any personal tips that when it comes to learning anxiety, or the anxiety of being compared, or underachievements, right? How do you cope with it?
Yeah, because this is something that people might think that, born in, even though I was born in the Taipei, but I kind of had most of my life in the States, people would think that, you kind of grew up in the U.S., you shouldn't really have that problem. But I wouldn't say that's true. During school, I would still feel, like comparison. I would still feel anxiety. These are all very common, like feelings. But I think the way I got over that, again, it's a long process. But to me, it's not in the beginning. Like in the very beginning, I got to the point where I just didn't care. I just didn't care. I really I just didn't care. Yeah, I just couldn't really care less.
Can you recall the moments that dawned on you? What is?
I think it has probably to do with like when I was a student, like for example, like in middle school years, like when I was during that time, right? People always like to compare, like, who has the latest fashion, who has the latest clothes.
True.
And yes, I got into that, like we all did. But eventually, I just one day, I woke up, I went to school, and I just told myself, like who cares if my shoes aren't as good as yours, or it's not as expensive as the brand. I mean, I'll just wear what I want. And in that time, I just decided to carry myself in that way. It's not that I don't care what people say. It's rather that what people say, I take the things that I think works for me.
Okay.
And the things that doesn't work for me, I just treat it as it's okay. Everybody has their own opinion. I'm not saying that you can't have your own opinion, but I'm just saying that, other people's opinion, it doesn't defy you.
I think that is quite important. And
right.
we also come to realize that we can never be perfect in every aspect, right?
Course.
And I think that the thing that you mentioned, that kind of toxic side of being a adolescent,
yes,
when you are at schools, like everything is being compared, and you are always competitive with your comrades, with your classmates, right? So you will be competing, who is the funniest guy, who is the prettiest girl, or whatever.
Right.
That kind of build up the anxiety, like that innate anxiety, and perhaps it affects your learning outcome as well.
Right.
And you would also compare how well you perform in each subject, I feel.
I think so.
But like you said, when we realize that that comparison is really not that important, the most important thing to you, what is it? Maybe you have to reflect upon it.
Right.
Sometimes I feel. And so right now, would you tell the students to maybe focus on what is important about for them in learning? Like, what do you think for FUNDAY students?
I think so. At least like for the classes I've taught and the students that I have met, I tell most of them to kind of focus more on learning something that it's applicable to them in their daily life. Sure, like if you like this as a hobby, then all right. But there are, of course, also some students who feel they're forced to learn. Right? I mean, this is very common for a lot of teachers. And there's also some students who they don't feel that they're forced, but they force themselves to learn. And I just feel like, forcing a little bit of anxiety is good for learning, right? A little bit of being, because it sharpens the mind, right? There's been evidence that suggests that it sharpens your focus, your willpower, all that stuff. But it overwhelms you.
Sometimes.
Right? It overwhelms you. And a lot of the students, they may feel overwhelmed because they try to take a lot of classes in a day, per day, really. And I always tell them, don't do that. I said, why are you? Yeah, I just feel like learning to improve is always a good thing. It's never wrong. But when you're trying to push it further, or you're trying to push yourself beyond your capability, that's where I think is the balance. That's where the equilibrium lies for me.
So before we started recording,
Right.
we were actually chatting about whether we remember the last time we could enjoy the pure experience of learning,
Sure.
the joy of learning,
Right.
whether there's still anything like that in our
Yes.
current life. But that is just my theory. I truly think that whenever you are learning something purely for yourself, for your own enjoyment, you will feel less anxiety, and the outcome and the effectiveness will be much better. But also, like you said, if you have certain level of anxiety and some pressure in class, it sharpens your mind. It makes you feel more sensitive. But a little bit of competitiveness is also helpful.
Right.
So how do we find a balance in between these two? If it's the two of us, or maybe you, like what would you do?
Well, I guess like in a classroom, if they wanted to, first of all, I guess it feels like I need to get to know the student and what type of learning style is suitable for them. Usually when I talk to them in the beginning, I can kind of tell already if they are in that certain vibe or if they give up a more of a serious vibe. And I think to find a perfect balance, of course, during the class, I would tailor it like for those who are more serious, maybe like let them do more things. Of course, recommendation would be, you could give them more material. Yes, you can give them more words, or you can, surprisingly, a lot of the students, they like to be able to kind of help out, right? So I really try to have maybe the more experienced students. How about the least experienced students? So even for those more experienced students, they feel a certain sense of, accomplishment, like a certain sense of achievement. And for them, I think the balance lies in, it really lies in what is the goal? What is your goal of learning English, right? Are you learning it as a hobby, or are you learning it as like a job, or are you learning it for that? I think you have to first understand why you're learning it. Once you understand the reason why and how, then it comes to the question of finding the balance, because I think the balance varies from person to person, right?
So that is probably one question that everyone who is watching this should reflect upon.
Right.
What is the reason of learning for you? Right. By the way, you just mentioned one thing I personally think is very interesting, even though it's irrelevant to the topic of today.
Okay.
That is, you will ask some other more experienced students to help out the less experienced students.
Right.
So I do believe that learning doesn't have to be a thing that is a lonely thing.
Yes.
It can be a collective thing.
Right.
It can be a group work.
Yes.
Even though a lot of students of ours, like they really enjoy a one-on-one class. But I in my imagination, the application of language is not always one-on-one.
Yes, exactly.
So sometimes you have to manage a discussion or conversation among like more than two people, right? So perhaps in a group session can sometimes make it sharper, make it better, maybe.
Yes.
But that is not really about the topic of today.
Well, it's somewhat relatable, I think. I still think that it helps the students to, number one, like have a sense of achievement. For the more experienced students, they actually like this feeling. And sometimes I think it's okay to give them the spotlight, to let them kind of have that feeling, and they appreciate it, I think. But also for the maybe the less experienced students, they might also feel, of course not every student, but some students may feel more comfortable. They would think that, it's another student like me who's helping me. It's not just the teacher.
Just sharing the past experience. Like these students have also encountered this issue. Right? So we are just learning from their past experience. I think that it's more relatable. It's not like the teachers telling you what to do.
Exactly.
Like sometimes it feels a little bit stressful.
Yes.
Probably.
For a lot of them, yes, it would feel very stressful.
So that will probably be all for today. And I think that anxiety is really a big issue in learning. Sometimes it stops you from progressing, but sometimes it pushes you forward, right? But just like Stephen said, right? So I think the most important thing for us, for learners, right? Whatever you are learning, you really need to find the real reasons of your learning, right? What is the purpose, and how do you balance the two emotions, right? So to find the best direction.
Yeah.
So I'm CJ.
Right, I'm Steve.
And we'll see you in the next episode.
See you next episode. Have a good one.